Okay, good morning everyone and welcome to the 34th meeting of the Social Justice and Social Security Committee for 2025. We've got apologies this morning from Colette Stevenson and Marie McNair, and I acknowledge and I welcome David Torrance, who is attending as a substitute member today. Agenda item 1. Our first item of business is to decide whether to take item 3 in private today. Are we agreed? Yes. Thank you. Agenda item 2. Our next item of business is our evidence session on the recently published UK Child Poverty Strategy. Now, before I begin, I wish to say a few words. I wrote to the Secretary of State for Scotland on the 4th of November to invite him to give oral evidence, either in person or online, on the UK Government's Child Poverty Strategy. A number of follow-up emails were sent seeking a response to our invitation. Last week, the Secretary of State's office confirmed that he was unable to give oral evidence and provide written evidence instead. It's disappointing to receive a response so late, but whilst we welcome written evidence, and we do welcome that, members will not have the opportunity to ask the Secretary of State about the content of that written evidence. We are keen to work with the UK Government on this important issue, and I hope that going forward we can work together to eradicate child poverty in Scotland. So with that now on the record, I welcome to the meeting Shirley-Ann Somerville, Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice, and Julie Humphreys, Director, Tackling Child Poverty and Social Justice from the Scottish Government. I thank you both for joining us this morning and invite the Cabinet Secretary to make some brief opening remarks.
Thank you very much and good morning, Convener. Eradicating child poverty is the Scottish Government's top priority and a national mission for us all, and I'm glad to see the renewed focus from the UK Government on this critical issue, albeit later than they themselves had envisaged. Whilst there is action to welcome, including scrapping of the two-child limit following unrelenting pressure from the Scottish Government and many charities, I am clear that more is still required to support families. There was initially very positive engagement with the co-chairs of the UK Government's Child Poverty Task Force in October 2024 and an interest in developing a truly four nations approach. However, sadly, this did not materialise. There was a lack of meaningful engagement from UK ministers, and despite sharing learning and experience from Scotland, UK ministers unilaterally decided to end four nations' engagement on the strategy earlier this year. Despite my repeated attempts, no ministerial engagement took place between May and December as the strategy was finalised. It is deeply disappointing that the UK Government failed to foster the consensus and partnership across governments initially agreed and to seize the opportunity available to us all. Instead, a strategy has been developed which sets no statutory targets for poverty reduction, immediately weakening accountability. A broad range of measures have been outlined, but this mostly represents a consolidation of previously announced policies rather than a commitment to further action. As the Poverty and Inequality Commission and others have highlighted, the strategy does not go far enough to support families with no recourse to public funds. It fails to remove the benefit cap. It continues to freeze on the local housing allowance rates. And these are all conscious decisions taken by the UK Government. The UK Government's own analysis shows that relative poverty rates are estimated to remain broadly stable across the UK as a whole, despite the measures in the strategy. 4.3 million children expected to live in poverty by the end of the decade. That is the scale of the ambition from the UK Government, that poverty remains broadly stable. In contrast, there is already clear evidence of the impact of the Scottish Government's approach. Child poverty rates have only fallen in Scotland because we have taken bold action, such as the Scottish Child Payment successfully keeping children out of poverty. Our action is making a difference, with the lowest income households with children estimated to be £2,600 a year better off this year as a result of Scottish Government policies. I will continue to urge the UK Government to go further and to match her ambition and action, and as they do so, we remain committed to working with and supporting the implementation of the strategy in Scotland. As the committee knows, the Scottish Government is now in the process of developing our third child poverty delivery plan. We've committed to reinvesting the money committed to the two-child limit payment to tackle child poverty, and we'll set out the details of our investments in the Scottish Budget to be published on the 13th of January. In conclusion, Convener, we will continue to review the UK Government strategy and indeed the written evidence provided by the Secretary of State, which we have not had the opportunity to look at in detail before giving evidence this morning. We will look at what it means for Scotland and for our next delivery plan, which is due for publication by the end of March next year. The Scottish Government is committed to doing all we can to eradicate child poverty, and the UK Government must do so. This strategy has to be the crucial first step, not the only step. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be with you this morning, Convener, and to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. A lot in that opening statement. Perhaps I'll start with the positives. As you indicated, child poverty has been falling in Scotland, and you've characterised, Cabinet Secretary, the UK strategy as broadly stabilising the current very high levels of child poverty elsewhere in the UK rather than driving it down. The positive, I would say, Cabinet Secretary, is that you suggested that in October 24, when engagement began with the UK Government, the UK Task Force, there was positive and constructive engagement. Could you say a little bit more about the positive and constructive engagement at that time?
Yeah, well, we certainly were keen to work with the new UK Government on this, and I appreciated the fact that they needed within the task force itself a private space for them as a government to be able to look at policies that they were developing. There was therefore the Four Nations subgroup which was convened. It would be fair to say that felt a little bit more transactional, where we provided information to and got a response from, rather than ever getting into a discussion and a genuine back and forth about how problems could be resolved and taken up, and how we could learn from each other. So there were the foundations to what could have been quite a successful Four Nations approach to this. Unfortunately, it didn't take place even when we had the Four Nations group. And then, of course, the UK Government then decided to end that. There was the promise of a bilateral following from that, but it did not materialise until the evening before the strategy was published.
Ask Cabinet Secretary, the engagement that did happen, that I think you described as transactional, but it was good the engagement was taking place. Was that at both ministerial and official level?
So at ministerial level, I laid out in my remarks when we had our last ministerial discussions. Well, I wouldn't say discussions, I'd say we provided them with the information and thoughts about what we thought were priorities, and so did other nations. But there was no actual discussions that really took place of any genuine substantive sense. Officials continued to meet after the ministerial meetings ended. Again, I think I would describe that as useful, but never getting into the detail of policies that were being looked at by UK Government, and therefore a genuine inability for Scottish Government officials to have very in-depth discussions about the impact that these may have in Scotland, learning that we could provide, or indeed learning we could take from what the UK Government was perhaps intending to do. So it would be fair to say I would describe it as suboptimal. Okay,
I might just roll my next two questions I've got into one, because I know there's time because colleagues wish to get in, Cabinet Secretary. Cabinet Secretary, can you see any of the policies that the Scottish Government was, if you like, advocating to the UK Government as could make a real difference reflected in the UK Government strategy that was published? And are you still in the dark, I suppose, in relation to why the dialogue suddenly stopped?
Clearly the aspect that we would warmly welcome is around the abolition of the two-child limit. It was clear, and we've said all along, that that was much better to be done at source rather than being mitigated by the Scottish Government. So that is to be warmly welcomed. I would, however, demonstrate that as an example of how, because we didn't know where the UK Government was going on that, we had to continue our work within the Scottish Government and within Social Security Scotland to be ready to mitigate the two-child limit ourselves. That is indeed very warmly welcomed, and it will make a difference to children right across the UK. The other caveat I would put on that, however, is because the benefit cap remains in place, that there will be many children that will not have the full benefit of the two-child limit being lifted, because they will then be hit by the benefit cap. Now, not in Scotland, because the Scottish Government will provide mitigation for the benefit cap, and that will be an additional expenditure that the Scottish Government will mitigate to ensure that everyone will benefit from the scrapping of the two-child limit.
And no explanation as to why the conversations ended with the UK Government?
So there was a feeling that they wished to move to a bilateral process rather than a Four Nations process, but the bilateral did not happen.
Okay, thank you. And I will follow up on the two-child limit later, so I will not explore that further. Claire Baker.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. It is unfortunate we don't have the UK Government here, as the letter, which I understand came late last night, reflects a different picture of the kind of engagement between two governments, but we don't have the opportunity to question them on that. The letter does talk about a monitoring and evaluation framework. The Cabinet Secretary said that there's no statutory target for the UK plan. There is a statutory target in Scotland, but my understanding is we're not particularly on track to meet that target. So there is a monitoring and evaluation framework that would be in place. I think that's been developed. If there's any discussions taking place, it says we'll continue to work closely with the Scottish Government to complement the monitoring and evaluation activity. But is it the case that in Scotland we do have a statutory target, but we're not as far along to achieving that as we would hope to be?
So we are determined to meet our target in 2030. I recognise that the interim target was not met. It has been more challenging for the Scottish Government to meet its targets when the headwind from the UK Government has been pushing children into poverty rather than lifting them out. As I said in my opening remarks, we now have the two-child limit lifted by the UK Government, and that will make a difference to the number of children living in poverty. So that is an important thing to recognise, and I'm very pleased that the UK Government has moved on that. In reference to the targets, I had a roundtable discussion in London with UK anti-poverty stakeholders for an exchange of ideas. And one of the things that came through very clearly from me was their real desire for the UK Government strategy to have targets within it. This was a roundtable that was had before the publication of the strategy. They were very clear that that was a very important part that they wished to see. So while there's monitoring and evaluation in it, it is not the same as the level of accountability that is there because of the targets. I said to a Scotland Office Minister when I met her in the late afternoon before the strategy was published, and at a time when we didn't actually have the strategy to discuss, I would say, so I had the meeting but not the strategy, that we would be very keen to work with the UK Government, as we have been all along, on the monitoring and evaluation and on the implementation of that. And I would hope that we could pick up those discussions early in the new year with her.
Thank you. You have said that the scrapping of the two-child cap will make a difference. I'm just trying to understand the figures from the Scottish strategy, and I don't know if you have the Spice papers, but it says the latest modelling, which includes mitigating the two-child limit, estimates 100,000 fewer children in relative poverty by 2030. So do we have modelling, if the two-child cap was to remain in place, what the modelling would be? So the 10% is, I'm assuming the 10% reduction is due to scrapping of the two-child cap.
So I'm not quite aware, if you'll forgive me, of the part of the spy briefing that you're referring to, but what we can certainly do is provide something in writing that will give our analysis of the impact of the scrapping of the two-child limit. We had, of course, done that type of modelling anyway, as we'd planned to mitigate it, so I'd be happy to provide that in writing. If you forgive me, I don't have that.
Yeah, that'd be helpful. What I'm trying to understand is if it had remained in place, I suppose I'm trying to understand what the impact of the Scottish Government's policies are. If you take out the two-child cap, if that was to remain in place, how many children would become? And I think if we accept the two-child cap reduces the number by 95,000 in Scotland, that would leave us with 5,000 children. But if we could get clarity in writing, that would be helpful. And I was going to ask about the impact of the increase in universal credit on Scotland's targets, but that might be something you'd need to maybe come back and...
Yeah, so I think where we're at the moment, and I...
Sorry for cutting across you, and you should answer, of course, and I apologise to Claire Baker, but we're all aware of questions that other members are due to ask, and there's quite a lot of overlap happening, Claire, but on you go, Cabinet Secretary.
So I think in the aspects around modelling of impact, because we were not aware of what was in the strategy until it was published, Scottish Government officials have not been able to model and assess the impact of the policies within that and their impact within Scotland. There's clearly modelling that's been done by the UK Government, and my officials are looking at that as we'd expect, but we're not at the point of having our own information on that, but that is being developed, and that will play a key role in our development of our child poverty delivery plan to see what the impact of the UK Government strategy is, and then that will be integrated into the modelling that we're doing overall.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
And apologies for cutting across you there, Ms Baker. I do not like doing that. Alexander Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. How will the Scottish Government spend the funds that were freed up that you had set aside to mitigate the two-child limit? It would be good to get an idea of what options you may be looking at as to where that funding could now be placed.
So the First Minister has made it very clear that that will be used on further child poverty measures. He made that commitment some time ago, and as I mentioned in my opening remarks, that is now forming part of the budget process, which the Government is clearly going through as we speak, and will be announced as we publish our budget. But that commitment to ensure that it's on anti-poverty measures is absolutely sound. We have clearly had letters, correspondence, as you would expect, from stakeholders with different views about how that money could be spent. I think it's very important as well that we will assess against the Scottish Fiscal Commission's analysis of the savings that, or the money that will no longer have to be spent because we're not doing the two-child limit. And I think it's important to recognise that we await those Scottish Fiscal Commission forecasts to see what that amount would be, and then clearly we will also have to look at the additional expenditure that we will have to undertake, as I've mentioned already, within the further mitigation of the benefit cap, and indeed the expected increase in demand for the Scottish Child Payment, because there will be more people that will be eligible for universal credit and therefore available to the Scottish Child Payment because of the scrapping of the two-child limit. So all of that will be taken into account as we develop the budget.
And you've identified there that by using that, the demand has increased in certain aspects of the benefits that you've already set aside here in Scotland, so that there are opportunities and options that you have to develop some of that, and that gives the government the flexibility potentially to look at where they might want to identify how they could impact in the poverty strategy that you've set out.
So the First Minister has made it very clear that the money that will be saved from no longer mitigating will be spent on child poverty measures, and we will be looking at that in the round as part of the budget process.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you. Jeremy Balfour.
Thank you. Just to show my ignorance in regard to financial things, is the money that has been left over that you've now got, is that a one-off annual thing, or do you see that going forward for the next 3 or 4 years? So if I'm a third sector organisation, do I come in and say, if you give me money for the next 9 months, I can do this? Or are you looking for long-term, not necessarily third sector, but just generally long-term funding projects?
So it's a recurring issue, because we would have continued to mitigate against the two-child limit for as long as it was in place. So it's a recurring amount of money.
And then, if I can, just very briefly, obviously you get lots of demands on how you spend your budget. I was just interested that a couple of weeks ago I was at one of the food banks here in Edinburgh, and they said to me the largest rising number of people coming to a food bank were young men between 18 and 22. Now, I understand that the First Minister has already committed this money, but I suppose with such a competing demand, is there a danger that certain other groups within society can get left behind because the focus is on one? And how do you balance that?
Well, you raise a very important point, Mr Balfour, about the competing demands within the budget. The First Minister has made it very clear that this money would be used for child poverty because the mitigation of the two-child limit was to tackle child poverty. What I would say is it's clearly not the only part of the government's actions to deal with the cost of living crisis, which many people face, not just families with children. But that's exactly why we invest around £3 billion a year in helping those on low incomes and to help tackle the cost of living crisis. So that's wider than just our work on child poverty. But for the money for the two-child limit, that has been that has or will be allocated to a child poverty measure itself.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Okay, Mr Balfour, I think we might be returning to you anyway.
I think it's not. Oh. Okay, my apologies, Cabinet Secretary. Too close to Christmas. What assessment of how changes to, and for example, universal credit, childcare, the minimum wage, and employment rights might affect child poverty in Scotland?
So at the moment we are still assessing that work, because it's very clear that there are aspects within the UK strategy that will impact right across the UK, and there are many aspects that are England only, for example. So there is areas, for example, around parents on low incomes accessing childcare that they need to return to work after parental leave and to earn increase earned incomes, which is welcome. We do know that the uptake of the universal credit childcare element does remain low, and it does appear that much of that is to do with a lack of awareness of support and availability of eligible services, and the genuine just complexity of the system that is still present. There is also a lack of clarity as to how support with upfront childcare costs for those returning from parental leave will be delivered in practice, with stakeholders advising that awareness of the Job Centre Plus-led flexible support fund is very poor. So there is work to be done there on the implementation of the policy to ensure that the UK Government is working to develop the take-up of some of the schemes which they are providing for. And I would also make the point that while any proposed increases in the statutory minimum wage rates are of course welcome, the UK national living wage is still not the real living wage, and that is a difference that needs to be recognised. How much those changes will impact in Scotland, as I said, I think earlier to Claire Baker, we're still modelling through that work as part of the Child Poverty Delivery Plan drafting.
Thank you. And then I expect you could talk for us for half an hour, but you can maybe just keep your answer fairly short. Is there more effective action that could have been taken in relation to measures that would apply across the whole of the UK?
Well, I could indeed talk for some time on that. What I think may be useful to committee is perhaps to provide in writing the details and the information, or some of the information at least, that we sent to the UK Government as we tried to move these aspects along. I think it's also important to recognise that the written evidence by the UK Government, I wasn't cited on obviously until this morning, so perhaps with the that we can wrap in perhaps some of the reflections I may have once I've had an opportunity to read the letter from the Scotland office in greater detail than I have, and that will go through some of the, I think, perhaps missed opportunities that were there that we were hoping to work with the UK Government on as the strategy was developed.
Thank you for that. Just so I don't have to jump in with one final question, just go back to the previous question. Will there be an obvious line in next year's budget that will show us where that money that was going to be used for the mitigation is now being used? Will it be something that you can point to or we can look at specifically, or will it be swallowed up, to use a better word, in the whole of the budget?
Well, rather than it being swallowed up, I think what it is a very important part of the overall importance that the government will be placing on this, because there will clearly be a number of parts of the budget that will be there to help tackle child poverty. So the budget is still being finalised at this point in time, so we haven't worked out the finer details of how that will be developed and presented. But we are very clear to, we recognise the importance of being able to demonstrate to stakeholders that we have developed that work, and the First Minister has been true to his word about using that money in child poverty, and will reflect on how we can demonstrate that within the budget itself.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Carol Mochan.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I suppose I'm interested a wee bit in, understandably, the UK Government, the Scottish Government strategies are set out differently in different priorities, and that's understandable. So I'm interested in just a wee bit of crossover. So to what extent are there similar policies already in place in Scotland that are included in the UK Government's strategy as well? You know, and do you see that crossover as being helpful, and are there some additional points you would raise?
So there are clearly areas where both governments have came to the kind of same conclusions about the drivers of child poverty and the important policy interventions that can be undertaken. We may have used different terminologies for it, but it's clearly important that we look at income from social security. It's clearly important that we look at the wider support that's given to people, for example, whether through employment or actually the support that can be given through other public services. So there is a read across about the drivers of poverty. I think it would be fair to say that is shared. There's a number of areas where there is also work that's been undertaken by both governments, sometimes very similar, sometimes separate. So clearly the UK Government has taken the decision on the two-child limit with regards to social security. We were disappointed that they didn't go further on the benefit cap or on the local housing allowance, or to implement something that would be equivalent to the Scottish Child Payment, for example. There are also areas within the UK strategy that are to do with early learning and childcare and employability and whatnot, that are solely to do with England, where we have policies which also are to do with early learning and childcare, and also recognise the importance of employability. And how that will be taken forward will be developed both in the budget and the Tackling Child Poverty Delivery Plan. So many of the foundations and the understanding of the drivers of poverty are the same. The policies sometimes differ in range or in detail.
Yeah, and you used an example that I had pulled out as well, just about the difference in the free child care and the way in which England are approaching that. And I suppose, are you keen to make sure there's lessons learned about how we might do some of the things that are positive in the UK strategy?
So we're very keen to learn lessons. That's why we actually wanted to work more closely with the UK Government in the development of the strategy, because we thought there might even be things we could learn from them. Who knows? In these aspects, we didn't have that opportunity, but we are very keen to look at that. I think what it's important to recognise is we have taken sometimes different approaches to policies in Scotland, and there are also policies that are available in Scotland that are not available within the UK. So I mentioned the fact that overall there's around £3 billion spent on low income and the cost of living crisis. We are developing and have developed the 5 family payments, including the Scottish Child Payment, which we invest around £500 million in, over £500 million in the free prescriptions, the free eye test. So there are a number of parts that are not in the UK strategy that are in the Scottish Government's policy areas. And I think it's also important as we look at where the UK Government has taken a different policy approach to learn any lessons from that. So there is a difference in approach in England around childcare, with that only being available to working families. And the Institute for Fiscal Studies has made clear that despite the investment that's been made, the poorest 1/3 of families will see almost no direct benefit from the new entitlements. And I also heard when I was down in London for my most recent round table that there are also some implementation challenges about a policy being launched, but challenges with delivery. Now, that's quite normal when a large policy like that is undertaken.
At times, yeah.
So that's the types of lessons that we would like to be able to learn, and would learn whether it's in England or Wales, about when different governments have taken different approaches about what's worked well and what some of the challenges that they face when they've done that.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Carol. Elena Whittam.
Thanks, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. As we've just heard, there's various measures that have been set out in the UK Government strategy that might actually give rise to Barnett consequentials, and I'm wondering whether you've had the opportunity to gather and generate an estimate as to how much those consequentials may in fact be.
So the UK Government budget resulted in additional consequentials of £820 million over the UK spending review period, and that's very important that it's over the spending review period. That does fall short of the investment that ministers had called for, and I think if I could summarise that with the example that it doesn't make up for the funding shortfall to meet the cost of the increased employers' national insurance contributions introduced in last year's budget. So while there has been an increase, it's important to recognise the time period of that increase, and also the fact that that hit from the employer's national insurance contributions doesn't even make up for that from last year. And I've already mentioned the fact that how we'll deal with the 2-child limit funding, and what our approach is to using the money that has been freed up from our commitment on that.
So anything that's been generated in terms of the actual UK child poverty strategy and any consequentials that may flow through from that, I think the committee would like to understand whether there's any understanding of what that would be and whether those consequentials would be funneled into child poverty measures.
So in my original remarks, I refer to this strategy being more of a consolidation of previously announced rather than new, with the exception of the 2-child limit. I don't know what language the UK ministers have used in their written evidence, but in the discussion that I had before we had the copy of the strategy, that was what was being inferred was that this was a collation rather than the launch of new things. So therefore, there is no additional consequentials that are coming from this, because there didn't appear to be anything that was new that would bring any consequentials to the Scottish Government.
Okay, that's very helpful.
And if there's anything in the written evidence that is to the contrary of that, I'm happy to look at that, but that is our understanding at present.
Okay, Thank you. Cabinet Secretary, we're approaching the end of our evidence session, but I might just finish off where we started, and that was in relation to the ongoing dialogue with the UK government. Now, for whatever reason, that appeared to have dried up and the bilaterals didn't happen. I'm just wondering what your preference would be, Cabinet Secretary, for a four-nation approach to solutions to tackling child poverty. So we draw on the experience of Wales and Northern Ireland as well, and share best practice and have open and honest discussions about what various governments think does work and doesn't work. Well, there's disagreements, that's okay, but just be clear about those, but sharing that best practice and continuing that conversation. Or was it the bilateral approach, which didn't actually happen in the end, that the UK government suggested? Going forward, what would you like to see happen, Cabinet Secretary?
So I think for me, whether it's four-nation or it's bilateral, it's how do we get past, I say what I would like to have, and then the UK government give their current position, and there's actually no genuine discussion. I think that's what we need to find a way through. I'm conscious of the fact when, in the day that the strategy was launched, Scotland Office Ministers suggested that they were disappointed that the Scottish Government was obsessed with process issues and we should get down to the details. But it's exactly because we wanted to get down to the details that we needed a process to allow us to be able to do that. And that's the type of thing that I would like to see next year, is how do we have a genuine discussion about whether it's difference in policies or whether it's lessons learned or whether it's monitoring and evaluation, or whether it's being able to look at the strategy that the UK government has developed in further detail and how it impacts on Scotland. For that to be genuinely meaningful, we need to be able to get past the transactional nature that we were in at the start of last year and get down to a genuine discussion. And I would very much welcome that. We're in the midst of drafting our child poverty delivery plan, so there is absolutely the space to do that. And I would hope that we could find a way for the UK government to think that that might actually be useful for them as they look to implement their policy too.
That's very helpful. Do any colleagues have any further questions? Okay. There'll be no further questions. Can I thank you, Cabinet Secretary and Julie Humphreys, for your support of our evidence session this morning. That does actually conclude our public business, and we'll now move into private session. Thank you.